Full house. Thank you for coming. This is the last tea of the season, so you guys are some dedicated tea and tail goers. We've got Brenda McLeod here today. But before we get into today's topic, I just wanted to wrap up what we did here this summer. And my name's Nikki. I'm the curator of the museum here. So our theme this year was in the first person, and our intent was to share voices from the past and bring them into the future. So we dug through the archives, and we found some stories that people had written, or autobiographies. And we also invited some friends and museum members to come in and tell us their memories about growing up in Pemberton, or memories of their families. So we heard tales in their own voice from George Walker, who passed away in 1992. Chief Leonard Andrew came and talked about his memories of Father Scott, and Father Scott passed away in 2001. We found an interview in the archives between the Faubourgs and Betsy Jack from 1958. She was a First Nations elder, and we read that. Louise McDonald helped with that presentation. And then we had Teresa Smith, who's a Gims, present her family research on the Gims family of Birkin. And her grandparents were Marjorie and Gunnar, and Marjorie was the first president of the Museum Society. And then we had Linda K. Thompson and Janet Miller, who entertained us with some stories from growing up the valley in the 1950s and 1960s. Those were some awesome stories. And last week, we had Eric Anderson. Eric is always a lot of fun, tons of energy, and he presented a story about the pioneer family, the Barber family that were pioneers of Squamish and Pemberton, and he talked a lot about the logging history of Squamish. So all these presentations we record, and we put edited versions up on YouTube, so if you missed any of them, you can find them on our website or on our YouTube channel. Today's tale is Remembering the 1940 Flood, Yesterday and Today, with Brenda McLeod. And we're going to be reading the reminiscences of Francis Decker, who survived the 1940 flood. It was considered the big one in recent times here, and it led to permanent physical changes in the valley, with the building of the diking system and flood control that started to happen in 1940s and 1950s. Brenda McLeod is the current chair of the Pemberton Valley Dyking District, and she's also the president of the museum. And she'll be reading Francis's memories of the flood and discussing the impacts that event had on flood control yesterday and today. Today, the Pemberton Valley Dyking District is one of the largest dike and flood protection areas in BC. Maintaining and upgrading flood protection systems ensures the valley remains beautiful, safe, sustainable, and prosperous, while being sensitive to the natural environment. And if you want more information about the history of flood control, they've actually got a great page on their website. So it's pvdd.ca, and just check out their history page. And before we started, we wanted to just give you some background on Francis Decker. She's an important person in association with the museum, because she was one of 3 authors of the book, Pemberton, History of a Settlement. And she wrote that book along with Margaret Faubourg and Molly Ronan. And that was the first attempt to record the human history of the area. That book was published in 1977, and you can get a copy of the book at the museum. She was involved in the research and writing of the first few chapters of the book. And the collecting of community history was an initiative of the Pemberton Women's Institute, and they were integral to the founding of a museum later in 1982. Frances, and her maiden name was Booth Decker, she arrived in Pemberton in 1927 with her husband John Decker and their 2 children, John and Fran. They came from the Caribou with their neighbors the Coopers and purchased adjoining acreages near Jack Ronan's farm. Frances and the children, though, lived in Vancouver while John established the farm for the first year, and then when she had her 3rd child, Jim, she did come back to Pemberton in 1928. Now, both Frances and John were really involved in the community, and they were involved in some of the first community institutions established in the area, including the Farmers Institute in 1925, the Women's Auxiliary of the Church of England in the 30s. John was involved in the Board of Trade efforts in the 30s. And then Frances was involved in the founding of the Women's Institute in 1940 here in Pemberton. Excuse me. The Deckers, along with their friends and neighbors, ensured future prosperity and strong social ties in the community through these various institutions. John was also famed for winning numerous agricultural awards in field peas and potatoes. He actually won so many awards in field peas, he was banned from attending the Chicago Fair for 3 years. And he came back, and what did he do? He won it again. Now, Decker was VP of the Farmers Institute in 1932, and he commended the early efforts of William Morgan Miller, W.C. Green, and the Ross brothers, the Coopers, and the Ronan brothers for helping to establish the seed potato industry, because the Dominion seed inspectors had been through the area and they endorsed the excellence and popularity of the product from Pemberton. And Frances, when she was president of the WI in 1949, she won the Tweedsmuir Cup for the best essay on a selected topic. The award was presented every 3 years by the Federated Women's Institutes of Canada on a Canada-wide basis. She says in her speech, "We will endeavor in all ways," she said, "to keep harmony in our institute and our community, to work for tolerance and cooperation amongst those of different creeds, of nationalities. Thus we will take a forward look in these anxious days, remembering the one who said, 'Fear not,' and remembering when we think of our motto, 'For home and country,' that home in the present day world means sanctuary for all in need of comfort, security, and the outstretched hand of friendship, and the country extends far beyond the boundaries of our beloved Canada." John passed away in 1972, and Frances passed away in the 1980s. Brenda Macleod's parents were Howard and Marion Ayres, who moved into Pemberton in the 1950s and settled on the Harvey Nelson farm, though we had some debate about this. And they were able to expand into new lands reclaimed through the Prairie Farmers Rehabilitation Act project. This was the flood control project. And there were many families who moved into Pemberton at this time after the PFRA project, as new lands were made available once the valley was drained and diked. And Brenda would have spent her childhood listening to her parents discuss flood control issues, and continues to contribute her time to the Dyking District to ensure the efforts of this project can be maintained in the future. So thanks for joining us today. Before we get going, I just want to give a big thank you to all the bakers that helped us get through our 7 tales this summer. We had Fran Cuthbert, Connie Sobchak, Judy McNulty, Flo Billenduke, Barb Brooks, Carol Morphy, Anna's Kate Kitchen, Katie D, and Heather Kelly. So thanks to the bakers for making this program a success this year. And thank you all for coming.
Good afternoon, everyone. And as Nikki said, I was going to read excerpts of Frances Decker's account. However, it's quite a story from a very strong woman who I don't think I could have done what she did in the 1940s, lived in a valley that was not protected by much of a diking system and was fairly isolated. So I'm going to tell her story, and as you will see, she was a very strong woman. She's writing to her children on October 20th, 1940. "Dear children, this is your story of the Pemberton flood. It will be such a long story that I could not possibly find time just now to send all the details to each of you in letters. Therefore, I am writing in this manner and plan, when the story is fairly complete, to send the scribbler first to Frances, then she can forward it on to you, Johnny, and when you have read it, you can send it back home, or to Frances again, as you see fit. You could not carry it about with you." She figures that he wouldn't have kept it safe, I think. "We're all hoping at home that you will not be worried by the first radio or newspaper reports that go out. We have listened carefully, but apparently there has been no news out of Pemberton as of yet, which must have been scary for the children. We are all well, the Coopers, the Rosses, the Kays, the Fowlers, the Girlings, and the Ronans. That is all we know as yet. For 2 weeks past, we have had unsettled weather. The good weather broke when we were half done the potato field by the house. When it cleared occasionally, there was a very little bit of fresh snow on the mountaintops, and we anticipated frost, but had none. 10 ton of crop shipped, all the rest in the field pits. Now I'm going to stop to just explain what a field pit is for those who don't know. In the early days, the farmers up the valley would build trenches or great holes in the ground and line them with various things like hay, pieces of timbers or wood to firm up the sides, and they would put the potatoes in the pits, what they call pits, and then cover them with soil. And that was the root cellar. And I did hear a story from one of the older people in the community that they really wanted to protect it. One of the McNulty farms up the valley, they wanted to protect their potatoes one day, so they thought that there wasn't quite enough soil on top, so they took the chicken coop and they moved the chicken coop and put it over top of the pit, just so that the snow would, remain off the top of the pit. So I'll continue. So they've got most of their potatoes in the field pits, and the epicure potatoes, that was a type of potato, at the front still in the ground. That was the way it was on Thursday. Another 10 ton ordered to go next week. Sacks are here, and about 75 sacks ready in the cellar for the new shipment. Thursday it rained all day. Sacking or any field work impossible. Wednesday had been the same, so that's 2 days of rain. In the barn, Tom's stall was full of the burpee stringless. In the bush still, that was beans. Dad and Bish, I think it was Bert Bish, cleaned them all and moved the fanning mill back into the feed room, sacking all the beans. Afterwards, that seemed a providential guidance, I guess because they saved the beans from being flooded. The floor of the barn on the side opposite the cows was covered with shallow bins of garden seeds, sorted, clean, and ready to sack, but left there partly because of the rush of harvest and partly for further drying. Thursday night it poured with rain, a warm rain, but at stage time, Bish went to the river and reported that the snags in front of our place were still uncovered, so that meant there was a little bit of freeboard in the river. The river had been very low for some time. We thought the heavy warm rain dangerous, but on hearing how low the river was, we decided no need to be anxious about the floods and turned our attention to the mail. Friday morning we were awakened early. It was still raining very heavily, mild, and the river very high, dirty yellow floodwater. Rainwater standing everywhere. There was a great deal of mist about. It lifted a little at times, then settled over the river. Watching, I realized the cause was the warm rain meeting the icy river water. Then noticed later a great deal of mist settled around Gerald's place, behind Kay's and on the back of Cooper's. Dad was sorting seeds in the barn. Asked him if he had been to the back field or the creek, or was he intending to go. He decided he wouldn't, as there was a great deal of water and he had a cold and only low rubber boots. Decided therefore that as soon as lunch was over, I would go see if the mist at the back was caused by flood water. Ryan Creek had been making a lot of noise. So I'll just explain to you, as you go up the valley of Pemberton Valley, I was going to try to get you a map, but none of the maps really were that great. On the left side of the valley is the Ryan River, and on the right side is the Lillooet River, and then the mountains. So all the land in between there was rivers on both sides of the pieces of most of the farms. After lunch, Cooper came over just as Rosemary and I were leaving to go behind. He and Bert Lundgren had been back in the morning. He reported the little creek on the rampage, bridge washed away, and a stream running down the potato patch. Rosemary and I went back on our place and found no sign of water anywhere until we came out from the field pea patch to the old trail along the little creek. You know the spot, Johnny. There had been a tree cut down and the trunk of the tree had fallen over an old corner post. Water was there and a small trickle going along the trail toward Ronan's, and a real stream about 10 inches deep going along the trail toward Cooper's. We did not venture further ahead, but stood a while peering at the creek through the trees. It was a terrible sight. Dirty gray water jumping up and over the logs much higher than the ground where we were standing. We backtracked and came across Cooper's turnip patch. He had, he says, 5 tons of turnips topped, ready for sacking. There were several large piles here and there. Also, as we neared the potato patch, there was creek water between the rows. The whole potato patch was a rushing creek. 2 good-sized pits still showed up in the middle, about 18 inches of water above them. We could see the potatoes uncovered in one pit. As the water reached the turnips, it turned toward Kay's, and all the far side of the clearing was a big lake. Arrived home at the house, made afternoon tea, and reported what we had seen. Jack Tellifer had gone up about 11 a.m. with a big truck and a rowboat in the back. We now know he was only able to go as far as Ross's place and turn back. Too much water. All these people lived up the valley, so I would say probably at least from, we're talking about people who lived in the north end of the Pemberton Valley. Sandy Fowler went back down, as we expected, groceries. Rosemary and I continued our explorations to the road and the mailbox. Met Jim at the gate. He had been patrolling the road since school was dismissed at 2:30 and reporting to Jack Ronan. He was only able to go as far as Sandy Ross's up the valley and Johnson's down the valley. The river was just at the top of the dike in front, as far as I could see down. Jim begged me to go down to the corner and see the grade. He wanted to go back down to tell Jack Ronan what he had seen at the creek. We walked down. There was only the usual amount of water visible after a heavy rain on our place, a very little river water coming down on the inside road. On the way down to the grade, I noticed our wagon standing where it had been used for the last load hauled, just down from the mailbox at the edge of the little pond, an axle deep in the seepage water. Also noticed by Rosemary's rockery tree, a small trickle coming over the dike. At the grade, the river was boss, a regular cascade coming over in 3 long spillways. Jim was determined to report to old Jack Ronan again, so I walked into the water on the road to see how deep it was. It was just above the top of Johnny's old rubbers, which I was wearing. I let him go if he would hurry home, and he did. Rosemary and I hurried back, noticed on the way that the trickle had widened to 12 inches or more, met Johnny, Eddie, and Cliff Ronan with shovels. Dad had just finished his tea, so we told him about the water and asked if Bish couldn't take the team out for the wagon. Dad had forgotten all about the wagon and sent Bish to harness the team. He went to Cooper's to see about the water, and from then on things happened far more quickly than I can put them down. Just as we had come in from the creek, the Coopers had turned their cows out into the field by their garden. Mrs. Cooper came. Then, as I was watching Dad tearing by on the saddle horse, and called out that she was getting the cows in. Jim had gone in by Cooper's gate as our lane was muddy, and I saw Dad run to him, and they both ran back to the Cooper's barn. Jim's bike was slowing his progress, what with the mud and all. Dad shouted, "Jim!" And Jim stood his bike by Cooper's big pile of shake bolts and ran to me. "The jam at the mouth of the canal has gone out. Dad is helping Cooper's. You are to help Bish get the wagon." We ran back to the barn and helped Bish down the lane after some maneuvering, got the horses hitched to the wagon. There was plenty of river water coming over all the dike then, knee-deep by the wagon, stopped in the lane to get the groceries and a sack of sugar and a bundle of bread. I climbed on the back of the rack with him, and Bish let the horses go with a rush. I shot off the back of the rack so fast I didn't know what had happened till I found myself up on my feet again, soaked from head to heels, a wet sack of sugar under one arm and bread under the other. Jim yelling, "Stop, Bert! Mummy's fallen off!" Bert stopped, back of the rack again, up to the middle this time and well braced. Cooper was coming out from his cellar in the barn with a wagon load of sacks, and I realized what he and Dad were doing. Stopped Bish again and asked if Cooper wanted another wagon. He did. We went right up through the barnyard gates and down to the cellar. Dad, Jim, Bish, and Mrs. Cooper, Winifred, and Miss Macy, the teacher, all took turns filling sacks and carrying them out to the wagons. It was nearly knee-deep when we began, and a strong current. I took the empty wagon down, and we swapped teams each time. Cooper taking the full load with his big grays. Ruby and Pearl were fine. Those were the horses. They had names. They had done very little for 2 or 3 days, and it was a mean job for nervy horses. Cold rushing water, all manner of boards and rubbish hitting their heels and drifting into the wagon wheels. And hurry, hurry, all the time. Finally, they loaded up the wagon. I took down and told Bish to take it away instead of swapping teams. We were putting the spuds into our barn. You guessed it, Tom's stall that had been cleared of the beans. They were temporarily out of sacks, so we started off with the load to help Cooper get sacks empty quickly and back again. In Cooper's barnyard, half between well, but this one place seemed bottomless. The horses stalled. I had never seen Bish in a jam with horses before, and I'm saying right now, I'd rather have almost any nincompoop you could mention. He's worse than useless. He has no horse sense at all. Every single thing he did was wrong. She seems to sort of seesaw back before with giving him heck and thinking he's doing a great job, so I don't know. After seesawing a while on the part of the team and considerable immature swearing on the part of Bish, we sank deeper and the tongue dropped from the neck yoke. I called Bert's attention to that little item, whereupon he threw the lines down in the water, jumped down upon them, and started to run to the horses' heads. By a miracle, they stood still. Back he ran to their heels and uncoupled them from the wagon, fished for the lines and took them out on the run. All this while I was speechless from shock and amazement at his lack of sense. I thought he was planning to do as I had been doing, take them up for the empty wagon and send Cooper down for the load. But what he was planning was to give the horses a beating, and he did do his best. By this time it was too late for me to catch him. He took them up one side of Cooper's new root cellar, I after him by then, and Cooper drove down on the other. I kept on running, but he had a good start. When he got opposite our house, they ran away from him. I feared they would kill or cripple themselves, and I ran for all I was worth, wet clothes and all. However, they only got as far as our gate, the lane to the barnyard, where they wrapped themselves around the big gate posts, and I do mean just that. They were wrapped around. Pearl was all tangled in the barbed wire, ruby clear, held by their locked bridles and the lines. Pearl with her legs and feet through the fence. Had only enough breath to say about 6 words and said them. Bish could only say, "You take Pearl, you take Pearl." I untangled her. She was like a kitten, so gentle and so scared, poor thing. Talked to them and hunted for cuts. By the time Pearl was clear, discovered our brave Bish was half in the barn with Ruby, called to know what he was doing. Putting them in for the day. No, yes, no, Bish. I'm not driving them, Mom says. Bring her out, I say, I'll drive them. Finally got his cooperation to the extent of holding Ruby while I hooked them up again. Then on to the Go Devil Bish. What do you think you are going to do now? Go down and take off that stranded load with the Go Devil Bish? Not me, and he wouldn't. So we'd drive down and around the cellars through the cold water again, and they never faulted. Good, true little horses. Got scared a few times, but just one word, and they stopped in their tracks. Then satisfied, we went back to our barn, and I put them in. Part of our harness was broken, and I couldn't hook onto the neck yoke, so I was only in the way. It was dark, almost, and Tom and our cows in the pasture. By this time, our pasture was full of water. The cows had no land left to stand on and were bawling every time I passed them. This all happened between 3:30 and dusk. Remember, this was only rainwater in Cooper's place until the jam at the canal broke, and it was almost unbelievable the rapidity with which the river rose and filled everything coming over the dike in about half a dozen places in front of Cooper Decker land. In half an hour, it was spilling over everywhere. Went down for cows. They crowded around me, bawling. Could not let them out as all gates were open, so left them, or expected to, and waded all the way across the pasture to Ronan's fence for Tom, who was stranded there and afraid to move. Had quite a time persuading him that I knew best. The cows had been at my heels all the way over and crowded around me every chance they got. Tom finally moved, and back we went to the gate and out into the lane. Did those cows go for the barn? They ran as hard as they could. While I was attending to them, Coopers got their last load up and drove the big pig up into our pen. The small pig and 2 suckling calves they put in the barn, turned the cows and 2 other calves out with horses. When Cooper was finished, the water was waist deep up our lane as far as the willow tree. We tried to persuade Coopers to come over for the night, but they preferred to stay home. The rain kept on coming down. We did not finish supper till late, took stock of wood and clean water, oil, etc., and decided we would not go to bed. Went out frequently to watch the water, which was coming higher all the time. Dad and Jim went out behind the barn and found plenty of Ryan Creek water. Mrs. Cooper had left our wagon on the north side of the barn, about halfway down the side, in the driveway to the fields. At dark, it was on dry land. At 9 o'clock, it was in 4 inches of water. Dad, Jim, Bish worked until 11:30, sacking up the seed that was on the barn floor that was drying. All afternoon and evening, the family had been hearing thumps and thuds from the creek, presumably. We decided then that the jam at the Ryan Creek had gone. So there was a big log jam, and the force of the river had moved the log jam, and so it had gone down the river and would probably end up down somewhere in this area. Eventually we went to bed, but not to sleep. Cooper's house was surrounded. The water came up to our fence in front of the house and spread up over the field beside the house. There was a stream running down Cooper's garden from the back. Just before dark, we had seen water all over Kay's. When we got up Saturday morning, the water was still rising, and such a sight met our eyes. Lillooet River and Ryan Creek, a rushing stream between Cooper's barn and the road, between barn and house, and between us all and Cooper's buildings. That is where the strong currents were, and another current down Cooper's pasture fence from the back, following the line of the ditches and the old creek bed. So it was like a river running right through their fields. From 2 rivers, the combination of 2 rivers. Cows bawling near and far, water up opposite the kitchen windows, over in the gem patch, that's another variety of potatoes. Water all over Cooper's except the strip of land along our lane from the big trees back. Our hay rake down below the willow tree with only the upper half showing. Cooper's shake bolts all piled against his fence by the stile. Jim's bike half lying on the pile of shake bolts. Cooper's big pen piled up against the shake bolts. Cooper's wagon still standing on the upper side of the new cellar with the wide rack on it, but only the rack was visible. All manners of sticks and rubbish collected against the fences. All manner of stuff going down across our fields. Water as far as you can see down through the Ronans. The men milked their cows in Cooper's, and we hurried breakfast, hoping to get Cooper's across to give them a hot meal. Had watched in vain for smoke. No smoke to be seen from any house. A heavy mist shifting about all the time. Could not see any distance. Dad and Bish made a raft as quickly as possible, and after several attempts, Bish got across to the far side of Cooper's field to the kitchen door. First of all, he had ridden one of the Cooper's grays across, but tried to get in at the little gate, and the water was nearly coming over the gate. He could not open it. Think he was afraid of the horse unseating him in the current. The horse came back to high land. Water was up on his sides in places, belly deep, nearly everywhere. Then after a couple of attempts, Bish succeeded in getting across. As I said before, Mrs. Cooper came when he called, and the water downstairs was up to her knees. They were all right, living upstairs, and would not leave the house then, as they wanted to move all their belongings up away from the water. We couldn't try again on the way back. The current caught Bish's raft and swept him down to Cooper's cellar. He had a hard time getting back, poor kid, and the water kept getting deeper all the time. We spent most of the time at the windows, could see 2 Ks in the attic of their cellar. The water kept rising, came under our front fence and up to the veranda all across the front. Midway through the morning, Rosemary came in crying, "Jim's gone for a ride on his raft and wouldn't take me." We all ran, sure enough. There he was, out in the middle of what had to be an epicure patch, another type of potatoes, on his little raft, called and waded out from the steps to the aerial post to call out directions to him. He turned back and after a little trouble amongst the stumps, got back to the fence where I helped him through the wire. The bottom wire was below water everywhere outside the house fence, and all along the front, the house fence, the water was the same. Jim tied the raft to the front steps and the water kept rising. Water running down everywhere in my garden. Only the fruit patch and garden path across to the lane out of water. Washed the beets in Ryan Creek, took the cabbage down under the north dining room window and washed it in the Lillooet River. Dad put a little stick for a mark on the path just near the corner of the house by the rockery. The water was half up the Cooper's windows. We felt very sorry for the calves and pig in the barn. The new cellar door of Cooper's was half covered with water. Our chicken yard and calf pasture full of water running off through the usual channel in the barnyard. In the afternoon we could see Cooper's at the upstairs window, and we felt so badly because we didn't have any way of getting across to them through that awful current. The current pushed the shake bolts through the fence and Jim's bike went out of sight. We hoped it wouldn't go too far. We didn't know how much longer it would last. The water was still rising. All over my lawn and garden beside the house. Do you children remember a long bed of glads I had years ago from the corner of the house to the rose bush? Frances Decker was an amazing flower gardener. She always had beautiful flowers. That was the ridge of the land that held the water from the back of the house. So the glads kept the water from coming because she had a bit of a bank where they were planted. We could walk anywhere behind the house on the usual paths. Just off the path by the kitchen garden, water was running in a thin sheet everywhere. We witnessed a sad happening in the afternoon. One of Cooper's cows had done a lot of bawling and rambling. She got the two black calves excited and they got into the deep water. They had got over in his pasture and seemed to want to come towards the barn or the other cows. Anyway, this cow went across to them and then started down the fence towards the road. Naturally, they followed on their side. When the cow got into the deep water, she swung away from the fence and back to high ground again, but the poor little calves kept on going, swimming and wading, until they caught the current at the side of the woodshed and they simply shot out of sight. We thought they had gone, but they kept swimming, got around the house and across through the fence towards his barn. One caught in the hay rake, and that was the end of that calf. The other got across into our pasture and swam across the fence. We called it, and it tried its best to get through the fence, but it could not. The current took it away towards Ronan's. Rosemary watched, but couldn't quite understand at first. She kept asking, "But Mummy, where will they find a place to sleep tonight? How can they lay their heads down under the water?" At dusk, the cow went down to Cooper's barn, again bawling, and we were quite sure she must have a calf inside the barn. We had planned to tie her up, but she got away before we got done. She swam all around the cellar and came back when I called. We put them all in our barnyard and tied her up. Dad and Bish went back to the creek in the afternoon and ran into Gerald. He was looking to see what had happened also. They found the old jam had broken away, but so much debris had come down with the flood that Ryan Creek was locked up tight, as Gerald said, for 100 years. The creek had dropped 8 feet since Friday night, and he thought we should soon see the water dropping here. The water began to drop in the late afternoon. We could hardly believe it at first, but in an hour or so it was plainly seen that the water was receding from the house. There had been no sign of life anywhere all day except at Cooper's window and Kay's. No smoke, just at dusk, 3 shots in succession from Fowler's set us all wondering. Went to bed early and got much happier. The water really was going down. Just before bedtime, I went out the front door and walked all around the lawn without finding water anywhere. This morning, we were all up early. The water had gone off our epicure patch and the gems all but a little standing between the rows at the pasture fences. Water all gone from Cooper's field on this side of his house. A little water running still in the lane from the back. We watched Cooper's house closely to see if there was smoke. So saw Mr. Cooper when he made his first appearance. Jim ran down the lane to see if he could find his bike. Bish walked all around the Cooper's field and then down the lane with Jim. They soon had the bike very dirty, but none the worse except for one bent pedal bar. Cooper went to his barn and found the floor planks and some old ties had floated together into a peaked pile, and up on top the calves and pig had taken refuge. All safe. He turned the calves out and did the silly cow run, and the calves, such a reunion. They were both sucking her. Then Cooper came over to tell his experiences, how they had wondered how we would reach them if it got worse, how badly they felt about the calves, and mad at the cow. They had spent Friday night and Saturday morning moving all belongings upstairs. The bars on the bedsteads that hold the springs were wet when they got around to moving them. They didn't lose a thing in the house. Cooper had nailed boards over the woodshed door. I ran over to see if they could come for a hot breakfast, and such a mess. The floor had a couple of inches of wet silt all over, and the water mark on the wall close to 2 feet high. However, neither Mrs. Cooper nor him wanted to leave until they had cleaned up the house, but they were all out of bread and fresh milk, so the children rushed over with plenty for them and hot porridge. They had coffee all on already. I forgot to tell you that Gerald and Edwina had been rescued from their home on Saturday morning. Billy Fowler went across with a boat and took them to Sandy's. The water was up to the tabletop. They lost their firewood, all their chickens, their coal oil, and their bicycle. Sandy Ross came down this morning. Cooper and Dad saw him at the road. Cooper got over near enough to talk to him. The government truck is lying on one side. They blew the dike around the government shed. Billy Fowler had come across Saturday morning to rescue their horses and get them to high ground. Eventually got them to be Girlings. Girlings were then prisoners in their house. Cows belly deep in the barn, going back across the river. Billy and Sandy collided with a cottonwood log and stove in one side of the canoe, pulled it up on top of Fowler's chicken house to mend it, and the chicken house began to move as well. Sandy went down to Ronan's and coming back called over to Cooper's that there had been water in Eddie Ronan's house, 4 feet at Blakeway's and 2 feet in Joe Ronan's. No water in Sandy's house, but pretty close. Water running in from the river through several holes in the dike. Bridget Gerald's gone. Bridget Fowler's gone. Grade between here and Ronan's badly washed out. Bridge at Jack Ronan's still there, but very shaky. Ronan's blew their dam. Jack Ronan had 2.5 feet of water in the house, but saved his bees. Robbie Miller walked up the road, and Bish called and asked him what damage they had down there. Robbie said they had lost 11 head and all their bees. Dad and Jim went back to see what had happened behind the barn and at the back fields. The creek had come in different places. One big stream came in through the field pea patch down the Green Mountain and all that side to the fence where the wild raspberries are. They turned and tore down through the potato patch and turned again to go down through the wheat fields towards Cooper's. Another stream came from Cooper's into the new potato patch, tore down through Johnny's garden and through the early St. George potatoes. Dad says he was very lucky to lose so little. There are potatoes lying all over the place, he says. 5 pits of Green Mountain gone, and of the other varieties, the odd pit here and there. Cooper hasn't a sign left of the potato pits he had at the back, and he had 5 ton of turnip ready to sack, so all that was gone. They are all gone. All our topsoil is washed away, and a layer of silt and fine gravel all over the place. Dad says he has a new ranch. On the Monday after, Cooper helping us with his team, we have been all day salvaging the Epicure and Gem pits that were hit the worst. The covering was stripped from several, and there is always danger of frost. It has been a very dirty job. We all mire down in the mud and the silt. The potatoes are filthy and the water cold, but we got the pits in that, we got the pits in that were standing in water. Blattler came up the road today. Johnson was badly flooded. They say he sat reading on Friday night. First his feet got wet, he put them on a box, then the seat of his chair got wet, and he put the box on a chair. Sat on that, putting his feet on the stove. Then the water got so high the box was wet, so he tore off an inside door and was making himself comfortable on his door raft when he remembered his cows were all tied in the barn, so he rushed out to save them and was so alarmed that he waded up to Blattler's with the cows through the water up to his armpits. Blattler said he was nearly all in when he reached his place. Ridley lost 7 head of cattle. Billy Fowler came to Cooper's today. The 3 shots at dusk on Saturday had been Mrs. Fowler calling for help. Billy had been gone all day and Sandy down the valley since Friday morning. She had only the 3 little ones at home. The water was over the top of the stove. Their bees were all drowned, 1 cow and 1 calf lost. They managed to get the cows on the front veranda. That would help them from being swept away, but I do not see how they kept their noses out of the water. Billy said they hadn't moved a thing upstairs. The flood took them by surprise. The first he knew of it was when he woke Saturday morning to find the mattress soaking wet and water running through the house. Poor Mrs. Fowler must have been nearly frantic with anxiety for Billy, because from the little we know, he seems to have taken the boat as soon as he got up and gone rescuing people, cattle and horses all day. And if anyone knew Billy Fowler, he put everybody else before himself, and this is very accurate account. Of course his mother wouldn't know that. Billy heard the shots at Girling's and went home because he knew his mother needed him. You could not begin to imagine the terrible mess the flood has left. The pasture is like a sandbar. Dad says it reminds him of mud flats, and that it is just about what it looks like. The 2 fences on the lane caught an awful lot of stuff. Cooper's wagon washed down to the fence. The rack floated and lifted the wheels along with it. There is a big dead cow on the fence line, and the fire log we had left stranded at Girling's 4 years ago washed down to Cooper's fence. Our lane is blocked with debris. I have not been out, but Bish says there is a bad hole in it where the current gouged it out. The mailbox went early. The fences on the road are all down, and on the lane partway and both of Cooper's, and all the gates are gone. So that was massive. They would have had a lot of fencing. 1 dead calf, a hay rake, a pig pen, and a wagon, all on a short stretch of the fence by Cooper's barn. And roots, stringers, boards, logs, fence posts, ties, boxes, boards, garden vegetables, milk boxes, tin cans, some of Mrs. Cooper's flower pots. We can see something shining over in the trees behind the Indian camp, but it is too wet yet to go and see. We are hoping it may be Gerald's coal oil. I am sure he would be glad to have it back. Wynne and the teacher walked down as far as Fraser's. They say they are all right down there, but plenty of water, but no detail of losses yet. Report has it that Dick Green went up to rescue Mr. Hartzell, and Carl Abraham refused to be rescued. Why, this is nothing, is what he is credited with saying. We are wondering if his pigs can climb trees. Tuesday after the flood. We took the last of the wet pits off the gem field this morning and went back to the earlies this afternoon. I am afraid I cannot begin to tell you how the back of the ranch is torn up. All the land that we thought high and dry was swept and gouged by that raging torrent from Ryan Creek. You may have seen a small patch of bank or slope ripped and scarred by water, rushing downhill, and that is just what happened here. There could not have been 1 foot of dry land anywhere back there. There are sandbars, gravel bars, 2 and 2.5 feet high, and there are holes dug out down to hardpan and below hardpan 1 or 2 feet. Green Mountain spuds all the way from the field where the remaining 2 pits stand down to the wheat field and through the clover. We picked up a big load out of the stream and sandbar that is where the early St. George and late turnips beside the oats. And we found everything under the sun in the way of spuds. We even found some of the Cooper's early rows. Cooper got funny and said, "When I dug out the first pink one, that little rose rose early," says Dad. "Yes, and the little devil came over here to leave by St. George astray, but she got caught out in the wet and lost the way home." Dad explained to the youngsters it was like digging for gold. We found them in pockets under the sand. Cooper and Dad thought they'd show McLeod the heap they found there and ask him to certify them. Then watched Matt develop apoplexy. I think we have about 8 or 9 varieties altogether. Funny what a flood can do to a conscientious seed man. The ground is very soft on the back as yet. In most places, it's impossible to walk over. The sand seems bottomless. Fowler got up to the valley today somewhere and we gleaned a little more information. All Groats Bend has been washed out. It will be 3 weeks at least before the road can be used again. At Frank Smith's on the road, there has been 10 feet of water. Lawkins have 1 foot. Lawkins is sort of closer to the lower part of the valley, not so far up. Fowler said we had it much worse up the valley. Ryan broke loose first, and when Ryan Creek went down, the river began to rise and broke all our dikes up there. Had our dikes held, the lower valley would have been washed out. The PGE, that's the railway, had a locomotive part on the railway bridge to hold it down, and it held. Wednesday, we worked at the pits all day. Some are very badly silted. Jim and Rosemary still at home helping. Only the Fowlers and Lexi at school. Bert Lundgren is making a footbridge out of a big cottonwood that was uprooted by the flood and fell across the creek at Gerald's. When it is leveled and a little handrail put on, the girling children may be able to come down to school. I believe they still have much water where they are staying, and they are staying indoors. There is a big break in the grade above Chris's place. There is absolutely no traffic on the road. The valley is at home collecting what is left of a bountiful harvest, the largest crop in years. Thursday, Cooper came again today to help us. We have been using his grays all the time as the land is very soft. Jim is teamster. Poor Bish even had a terrible time with the grays. Guess he is like Francis, allergic to horses. Jim is learning fast. Cooper spent yesterday digging out odds and ends that were buried in the silt. The old cellar is filling fast now. Mrs. Fowler came over today. She was alone all Saturday and Sunday night. She forgot to take food when they went upstairs, so they were without food except for 1 loaf of bread and half a jug of milk. Tommy had held a pig up in the water for a long time to keep it from drowning. He held it by its ears and got so chilled that he was sick afterwards. Millers lost all their pigs, 9 I think. Happy Shire and family were marooned on a bed. Henry Erickson cut a hole in the ceiling and they crawled up into the attic. Greens had 1.5 feet of water in the house. Fraser's the same. McCulloch's went to the barn. We have all been very anxious about the people living above Girlings, so tonight Jim and Bish took a lantern and waded up. There are several places on the road where the water is knee-deep out in front of Cooper's near Gerald's Bridge that used to be, and in the low spot between Eric's cabin and Chris's place. The Girlings have not lost anything at all. They only had the river flood, which was highest on Saturday. They had put all the pigs in the barn and the calf was born in the water and lived. However, there is a break 30 feet long and as deep as the bottom of the river, they say, in the grade, and it will not stop running until the river goes down to freezing level, if it stops then. In the meantime, there can be no traffic at all above their place. In order to walk up the road, a detour must be made a way back in their field, which means tough luck for all those there who have produce for market. We have not heard word of Bartow yet. We are all hoping the cats lost some of their lives. Roy went down to Wilson's where the river began to rise. The water reached the back window of the car in Wilson's shed. John Jacks was nearly drowned, but managed to get to Wilson's. No word of Landsborough. Lukey made a raft on the spur of the moment and evacuated himself and Mrs. Ball down to Wilson's. The raft struck a snag and capsized, but Lukey did the heroic, saved the gal's life, dragged her back on the raft and to safety at Ed's. Old Dunk Morrison had to take to the rafters. Fisher took up his valuables and got to his barn, where he was marooned for 3 days without food. In the excitement, he hadn't thought of eating. Guess he hardly expected to live long enough to need another meal. The barn was very shaky. It is flimsy erection of poles and shakes. He said it creaked and groaned continually. He expected to be tossed into the flood at any moment on the 3 days. No, Johnny, I do not care to live on our new land between Morrison and Fisher. Frances said she wanted to be the cook when the men went to work on the upper place, and she is a better swimmer than I am. He made a raft to get to the barn, and halfway there it capsized. His hip boots filled, and he had all he could do to pull himself back to where he could stand. Fortunately, he capsized near a barbed wire fence and pulled himself along hand over hand. His dad was watching. The current in this flood was terrible. They have had floods before in plenty, but nothing that ripped and tore along as this one did. Once in the current, a raft was helpless. I do not think a good rowboat would have been manageable, and certainly not a canoe. What a flood. Compliments of Fran Decker and 3449 West 28th in Vancouver.
So,
as Nikki told you, I am the chair of the Dyking District. And the reason being is I have survived a flood in Pemberton too. So I'm going to just tell you a little bit about the history of after that 1940 flood. There was, and even before the 1940 flood, the farmers up the valley had wanted to have some sort of diking protection so that they could continue to farm and farm without having to worry about losing their crops. So in the early 1944 and from then to 1947, there was a lot of the PFRA came to the Pemberton Valley, and a lot of very talented surveyors and I guess I don't know what you call them. Government officials came and did a lot of work. Burnett and McGugan did a report. They came to Pemberton in March 2nd, 1945, and at that time J.C. Moore of the PFRA was in the valley in charge of making complete topographical surveys of that portion of the Pemberton Valley, roughly from the Green River, which is on the other side of the village of Pemberton, to lot 168 at the north end of the district. All the records and plans of an extensive and complete survey of the valley from the Lillooet Lake to the point between Miller and Ryan Creek was made in 1930 by Cleveland and Cameron of Vancouver. And the purpose of the investigations were that and this is written from the report, and the surveys, was to ensure information required upon which to base a report of reclamation, outlining the probable degree of reclamation, the methods to be employed for the probable extent and success of the methods that they would use, and the costs involved of works and the cost per acre of the expenditures. So they basically wanted to figure out how much it would cost. And the PFRA, along with the Dominion government, which was the federal government, and the provincial government, were keen to have people settle in the Pemberton Valley and farm. So they thought this would be an investment. If they invested in the dikes, then people would move here and farm the land, and it would become economically viable to live and farm in the valley. And in this report, they comment that a committee of 6 residents of the Pemberton Valley with headquarters at Pemberton have been very active for some years in an effort to discover some means by which the rich alluvial soil of the district could be improved to allow 100% development. They have gathered together a great deal of local information referring to the river, the amount of land at present cultivated, and historical data. All of this has been freely made available to us. So when the PFRA did their report in 1945, they went ahead with building the majority of the dikes in the valley, and they started at the upper end of the valley because that's where all the farmers were, and they started working their way down the valley. They had hoped to sell a lot of land to recover their costs from their investment from the government, and unfortunately that didn't happen quick enough, so they lost steam, and on the other side of Pemberton Village, they ceased to build any more dikes, so there isn't much diking on the going towards Mount Currie. There's hardly, there is a bit of diking, but that's sort of where they stopped, unfortunately, because of the cost and the fact that they couldn't recover it. And then Nikki told you that the Dyking District was formed in 1947. The organization initiated building the dikes and straightening the Lillooet River and the Ryan and Miller Creeks, and it continues today. Unfortunately, many of us, there's a few of us here who survived the 1984 flood, October of 1984. There was a significant flooding in the valley. I was pregnant with our youngest daughter. My husband was running an excavator. It's fairly scary when the water, I was at church and my husband comes in and says, he's come down from up the valley where he was working, he was a road builder, and he said, you know, it's really warm out and it's raining really hard, and he said, I think we're going to flood. And we all went home and we started looking at what we needed to do to take things up from the basement and to make provisions for animals and whatnot, and to help our neighbors. And it did end up happening, and it happened very quickly. And my husband was injured trying to salvage part of the dike that was falling in. It was a difficult time, and most of us ended up moving into the village of Pemberton because it was on high ground, and there were many homes that were severely damaged and flooded, and it's definitely not a nice experience. And then again it flooded in 1991, and the 1991 flooded. Sometimes the floods flood certain areas depending on if it was the Ryan. That I think the Ryan and the Green came up significantly, and there was lots of problems on the Duffy Lake Road as well. In 2003, there was another significant rain event occurred, leading to significant flooding in the southern end of Pemberton Valley, so down on the other side of the village, leading to a major bridge washout on Highway 99 at Rutherford Creek. Some gentlemen lost their lives when the bridge went out. Weather forecasters said a rainstorm like this occurs once in a century. Environment Canada's David Jones said the region had been between 200 to 350 millimeters of rain during that storm. That's the problem that happens, is the rain during warm weather, and if you've had any snowfall in the tops of the mountains, it comes down, and if it stays warm, then the rivers come up and they flood. The dikes in the Pemberton Valley right now have a 200-year floodplain level capacity, so they can withstand a fair amount of water volume coming down the river. And the Dyking District is very proactive in keeping our community safe and free from flooding. And we lobbied for something like 17 years to have gravel removal ability from the Lillooet River, and finally in 2013 we were given the authority to remove built gravel that builds up on gravel bars in the Lillooet River, and remove the gravel from those bars. And in the last year we have been given authority to do that without having to seek permission every year. So now what will happen in the Pemberton Valley in the Dyking District's job will be they'll go from, we rotate, we have about 4 gravel bars where we visit them once every 3 years and remove the gravel from those bars, and that gives more berth for the water coming down during high water times. We also have, the Dyking District has had, if you've traveled over the Duffy Lake at one point in the past in 2011-12, sometimes there was water over the road going through the Mount Currie lands towards the beginning of the Duffy Lake. There's problems with the Birkenhead. When rivers have high water, they bring lots of debris and gravel, and the Birkenhead had completely shut off part of its river and found new tributaries. And so what it was doing, the river should go like this, and it was going like this. It was going all over the place in little streams and coming over the road and flooding people's homes in the Pemberton Mount Currie area. And I'm really pleased to say that what we did is, for the first time ever, we had all of the stakeholders together at a meeting to be concerned and to care about a situation and to move forward and share in the responsibility and the financial responsibility of fixing a flooding problem. So it was the Dyking District, the Squamish-Lillooet Regional District, the Lillooet Nation, the Mount Currie people, the Village of Pemberton, the Ministry of Forest Lands and Natural Resources, the Inspector of Dikes, Emergency Management BC, the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure, and Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development. That's a lot of people to bring to a table. I was there. Some people didn't want to commit to financially putting money into a project to fix the problem forever at the Birkenhead River. We eventually did work that through, and I'm proud to say that we don't have flooding in the Birkenhead area as a result of people working together as a team. And we continue to maintain and look to the future with projects like that that will stop flooding from happening into the future. More recently, there has been problems with high water in the Pemberton Village area, Pioneer Junction, which is one of the condominium areas where the Pemberton Creek has decided to do its thing, and we have gravel build up in the Pemberton Creek. And so what we've done is we've repaired riprap in the Pemberton Creek, and also we have, this year we are working right now as we speak on a Pemberton Creek sediment removal project, whereby they're going to take the sediment out of the Pemberton Creek so that will ease any concerns with flooding into the condominium developments that are right adjacent to the Pemberton Creek. And again, that's done with the Village of Pemberton and all the stakeholders working together as a team, which works best. What the Dyking District does now is we do regular dike and boat inspections down the river to make sure everything is okay, and if we see a spot where something's eroding, our excavator and our crew, or if we need other people or we need other resources, we get those resources and we fix the problem. We started the gravel removal in 2014, which I'm so excited to say is probably going to make a big difference in the future. We replace culverts where they need to be replaced. We clean up ditches, mow the dikes. We clean the Arn Canal, which is another important waterway in the Pemberton Valley. We have quarries now where we can get instant gravel for any repairs we need to do in the Pemberton Valley. with regards. So if we have concerns about an area, if the water comes up, we can instantly go to those resources and get get that gravel if we need, or riprap if we need to reinforce the dikes so that they withstand the high water. We have an early warning system up in the Lillooet. I don't know if you heard about the landslide we had. That was a couple of years ago now. And it was pretty scary. There was no water coming down the valley, and it was because there was a huge landslide with the dam building up behind it, up at the upper end of the valley. We now have an early warning system up at the end of the Pemberton Valley that will warn us if there's no water coming down or if any changed conditions. It's a piece of technical equipment that I don't really understand, but it will give us warning, and it goes straight to the village of Pemberton and the SLRD to warn them of any concerns that they have. So next year, the Pemberton Valley Dyking District will be celebrating 70 years of managing drainage and flooding control in the Pemberton Valley, and the Dyking District, along with all the other stakeholders in our community, will continue to ensure that the residents of the valley stay safe and that we don't have to experience a 1940 flood, hopefully. Thank you.